Not all wounds are visible. Not all heroes wear uniforms. But some still wear aprons and carry coffee pots. They show up every morning before the sun rises, smile through the judgment, and serve kindness with every cup. You might pass them by without knowing what they've survived, or who they once saved. If you believe justice lives in the unseen moments, like, share, and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because sometimes, the quietest acts of courage are the ones that deserve to be remembered the loudest. This is one of those stories. Nestled in a sleepy Colorado mountain town where winter winds blew sharp against shuttered windows and strangers were noticed more than welcomed, Tanya Brooks walked with quiet purpose. She didn't move like someone trying to be seen. She moved like someone used to scanning for exits. At 36, Tanya had already lived through more than most in that town ever would. A former Army combat medic, she had served 2 tours in Iraq, patched up soldiers under fire, and pulled bodies from wreckage with her bare hands. But the moment that changed her life forever wasn't on a battlefield. It was inside a Humvee, rocked by an improvised explosive device that sent shrapnel tearing through the right side of her face. The military called it non-lethal injury. But back home, it was the kind of thing people stared at before looking away too fast. Her resume boasted medals, trauma certifications, field leadership experience, things that once commanded respect. But each interview ended the same way. Polite thanks. Hollow apologies. Awkward glances that drifted toward the scarred flesh tugging at her jawline. A recruiter had once muttered she was too intense for front-facing roles, and after months of unanswered applications and dwindling savings, Tanya stopped correcting them. She eventually found herself at the door of Maple House Diner, a 1950s-style roadside cafe with peeling vinyl booths, a jukebox that hadn't worked since Reagan was in office, and the faint smell of burnt bacon baked into its walls. The owner, Grace, had been looking for a new waitress but looked unsure when Tanya walked in. Her eyes hesitated at the scar before she said, "We open at 6. Uniforms on the hook in the back. Don't be late." It wasn't a warm welcome, but Tanya wasn't looking for warmth. She was looking for a paycheck and a place where her hands could stay busy. Every morning since, she tied on a thin apron over her collared shirt, clipped on a name tag that simply read Tanya, and pinned a small American flag next to it. She didn't speak much about her past, didn't need to. People assumed enough just from the look of her. Most regulars never asked how she got her scars. They just avoided her table when they could. A few whispered. Some stared too long. But Tanya smiled anyway, quietly, carefully. She carried trays like she once carried stretchers, fast and focused, with no time to think about pain. Her scars told a story no one wanted to hear, so she let her service speak instead. She learned early on that dignity wasn't something people gave you. You had to hold on to it yourself. And in a town that only saw the surface, Tanya carried her past like a secret stitched beneath her uniform, one quiet cup of coffee at a time. Tanya never spoke about her time in the army. Not to customers. Not to coworkers. Not even to Grace, who signed her checks every Friday without so much as a thank you. Her past was stitched into the fibers of her uniform, the tiny cross pinned above her heart, and the American flag tucked beside her name tag, but no one ever asked what they meant. She didn't offer explanations. She didn't need sympathy. All she wanted was to do her job, keep her head down, and maybe, in time, disappear into the routine of refill requests and scrambled eggs. But anonymity was hard when your face told a story before your voice ever got the chance. Most mornings, the same group of locals gathered in booths under the hum of flickering fluorescent lights. They'd been coming to Maple House long before Tanya arrived and made no effort to hide how they felt about her presence. She caught the sideways glances, the way a few regulars leaned in and whispered behind coffee cups. One man at the counter had even joked, just loud enough for her to hear, that Halloween came early this year. Someone else had chuckled and said, "Scarface pours a mean cup of joe though," as if the nickname was clever. She learned to tune it out. Sometimes, she caught patrons pointing their phones at her, pretending to check messages while snapping blurry pictures of her from across the diner. The first time it happened, Tanya confronted the man, asking calmly but firmly that he delete it. He laughed in her face, said he was just texting his wife. Grace told her to let things go after that. "You're not here to stir trouble," she said. As if it was Tanya who had done something wrong. She took it in stride. The army had taught her discipline. Patience. The kind of strength that held when everything else fell apart. But even discipline has limits when the judgment comes disguised as customer service. One chilly Tuesday morning, while Tanya was clearing plates from table 6, a young boy no older than 5 turned from his pancakes and asked his mother loudly, "Mom, what happened to her face? Did she get burned?" The question rang out clear across the room. Tanya froze for a moment, her back half turned. The mother's eyes met hers, then dropped. Without a word, she grabbed the boy's arm and hurried him out, muttering, "Don't stare. It's rude." She didn't look back. She didn't apologize. Tanya carried the plates to the sink without flinching, though her grip had tightened just enough to chip the edge of a coffee cup. She exhaled slowly, then forced a smile as the bell above the door jingled with a new customer. Even her co-workers weren't immune to the discomfort. Cassie, the bubbly server who'd worked at Maple House since high school, had once been friendly in passing. But lately, Cassie made a habit of avoiding Tanya's section when they worked the same shift. "Mind if I take table 4 instead?" she'd ask, smiling too sweetly. "They can be a little particular." Tanya knew what that meant. She didn't argue. She just nodded, poured more coffee, and moved on. It wasn't that Tanya expected kindness. She just hoped for decency. A little space to work. A little respect. But with each shift, the air grew colder, not because of the weather, but because of the invisible walls people built between themselves and her scars. Every time she tied her apron, she felt the silence settle over her like snow. Heavy. Unspoken. Relentless. Still, she showed up. Every single day. And somehow she kept smiling, because that's what you do when the world only sees your damage. You smile like it doesn't hurt. You serve like it doesn't matter. Sunday mornings were always the busiest at Maple House Diner. Churchgoers filled the booths by 8:30, and by 9, the line snaked out the door, the cold mountain air biting at bundled-up families waiting for hot coffee and pancakes. Tanya moved quickly between tables, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace. She didn't mind the chaos. It kept her hands busy, her mind focused. But lately, even the comfort of routine was wearing thin. Grace, the owner, had been curt all morning. Every time Tanya passed the counter, she caught the woman's eyes flicking toward her and then darting away. There was a stiffness in her jaw, a tapping of her pen against the receipt book that hadn't been there before. And when a customer at booth 3 left without finishing their meal, Grace muttered under her breath, "We can't keep losing regulars like this." She didn't say Tanya's name. She didn't have to. Tanya swallowed the lump in her throat and went back to the coffee station. Around 10, a group of 4 well-dressed men entered the diner, their cologne sharp and voices louder than the background music crackling from a jukebox. They wore designer coats and golf hats, out-of-place luxury in a town like this, and took a booth near the window, laughing as they shoved into their seats. Tanya approached with her notepad, forcing a smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. Can I start you off with coffee or—" One of them cut her off, squinting exaggeratedly at her face. "Whoa," he said, loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Did we walk into a horror movie set?" The others burst out laughing. Tanya stood still, her pen hovering over the pad. She didn't flinch, didn't react. Her expression remained neutral, but the flush creeping up her neck betrayed her. Another man, grinning, leaned across the table and added, "Hey Freddy Krueger, we ordered coffee, not nightmares." The joke landed hard, louder laughter erupted, drawing glances from nearby tables. A few customers looked uncomfortable. Most just looked away. Tanya nodded once, calmly. "I'll give you a moment to look over the menu," she said quietly, then turned to walk away. Their laughter followed her down the aisle like smoke. From the corner booth by the coat rack, a teenage boy had been watching the exchange closely. Elijah Hayes, 15 years old, sat next to his mother, half-eaten pancakes in front of him. He hadn't taken his eyes off Tanya since she'd first come to their table earlier. Unlike the others, Elijah wasn't looking at her scars. He was watching her silence. Watching how she stood tall even as those men tried to tear her down with words. There was something in the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, jaw tight, voice steady, that reminded him of a story his father used to tell. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, pressing just above his heart. A gesture of respect. A signal. Tanya didn't see it, but Elijah held it there anyway. Back behind the counter, Grace avoided eye contact again. Tanya refilled a pot of coffee, pretending her hands weren't shaking. Pretending her cheeks didn't burn from the humiliation. She'd faced mortar rounds, gunfire, and bloodied comrades screaming in her arms. But somehow, the snide laughter of 4 smug men in a warm diner cut deeper than she'd expected. And yet, she didn't quit. She wiped her hands on her apron, straightened her name tag, and walked back out to face the next table. Elijah hadn't said a word since sitting down that morning. While his mother chatted with the waitress who served their drinks, and the other diners went about their business, he stayed quiet, watching. Not in the way people usually watched Tanya. Not with discomfort or curiosity. His eyes followed her with a quiet, reverent kind of recognition, as if trying to line up the person in front of him with a memory he'd carried for years. Every time Tanya walked past, Elijah's hand instinctively moved to his chest, resting flat over his heart. It was something his father had taught him, a simple sign of respect used in the military, a silent acknowledgement of service and sacrifice. Tanya never seemed to notice, too caught up in the rhythm of refills and orders, but Elijah kept doing it. He didn't need her to see it. It wasn't for show. He already knew who she was. It had taken him a few minutes to be sure. At first, he just noticed the way she moved, controlled, deliberate, like someone trained to navigate chaos. Then he saw the tiny flag pin next to her name tag, barely visible unless you were looking for it. And finally, her eyes. Not the scars. Not the hollow looks she got from customers who couldn't stomach their eggs if she brought them. It was her eyes. There was a strength in them, something that couldn't be broken or buried. He remembered those eyes from a photo. On his father's desk at home sat a wooden frame with a picture his dad never let gather dust. In it, a much younger Tanya, no scars, no apron, stood in desert fatigues, smiling with exhaustion beside a group of soldiers. Elijah's father, Captain Marcus Hayes, had told him the story behind that photo more than once. How their convoy had been ambushed outside Fallujah. How the medics were overwhelmed. How one of them, Sergeant Brooks, refused to leave his side, even when shrapnel rained down around them. She dragged his father from the burning wreckage of a Humvee, patched up a shattered leg under gunfire, and carried another wounded man back to the med tent before passing out from blood loss herself. His dad had described her as fearless. Smart. The kind of person who didn't think twice when someone else's life was at risk. The photo had stayed on their mantle through 3 moves and 2 deployments. Elijah had grown up seeing it so often that her face, before the explosion, was etched into his memory. And now, seeing her here in this forgotten diner, carrying plates and enduring whispers with that same unshakable resolve, he didn't doubt it for a second. He didn't need the scars to tell him what she'd been through. No one else in the room knew. No one else could have imagined. They saw a disfigured woman with a quiet voice and a stiff posture. But Elijah saw the woman who had saved his father's life. Twice. His mother, Patricia, hadn't noticed his stillness, nor the way he kept clutching his chest. She was scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at the specials board, unaware of the silent weight pressing on her son's heart. Elijah didn't speak. Not yet. But inside, something had already shifted. He knew he wouldn't stay silent much longer. He could see the hurt Tanya carried, how she swallowed it down every time someone looked away from her face. And he knew, with the clarity only truth brings, that soon, the rest of this town would have to see her too. The lunch rush had peaked, and the noise in the diner was almost enough to drown out the undercurrent of tension Tanya had felt growing all morning. She moved from table to table like usual, quiet, steady, hands slightly trembling from exhaustion but never spilling a drop. Her scarred cheek flushed from the heat of the kitchen, but her expression remained calm, practiced. She'd been holding it together all shift. Until table 7. 4 men sat in a booth near the back, newcomers, dressed like they were too rich for a place like Maple House, but loud enough to make sure everyone knew it. Tanya had served them earlier without incident, though one had smirked when he first saw her and whispered something that made the others laugh. She returned with their coffee refills, setting the mugs down with care. Just as she turned to walk away, the man closest to the aisle, tall, silver watch glinting, tilted his glass sharply. Water splashed across the floor, spreading toward the edge of the booth and beneath Tanya's shoes. "Oops," he said with mock innocence. "Looks like someone made a mess." Tanya didn't respond. She simply nodded and reached for the cleaning towel tucked into her apron. As she knelt to wipe the spill, the man leaned forward and muttered, just loud enough for her to hear, "Trembling hands and a face like that. What did they do, botch a brain surgery too?" Laughter erupted from his table. Tanya's breath caught, but she didn't look up. She pressed the towel into the water, eyes fixed on the floor, willing the burn in her chest to stay hidden behind clenched teeth. Her palms were soaked, knees pressed to the cold tile, her silence as sharp as a blade against the laughter that surrounded her. She didn't see Grace emerge from behind the counter, didn't notice the hush spreading slowly through the diner. But she heard the words. "Tanya," Grace said, voice clipped and shaking slightly. "I'm sorry. This just isn't working out." Tanya paused. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was damp from sweat and humiliation. Water dripped from the towel in her hands. "You're scaring the customers." The words landed harder than the insult before them. A chair scraped against the floor. From across the room, Elijah Hayes stood up, his hands clenched at his sides, chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. He looked smaller than he felt, but his voice cut through the silence with an honesty that didn't need volume. "She saved my dad's life. Twice." Every head in the diner turned. Elijah's voice trembled, but he didn't falter. His gaze never left Tanya, who was still kneeling on the floor, towel in hand, eyes wide in stunned disbelief. "She was in Iraq. My dad, Captain Marcus Hayes, he told me everything. How she pulled him from a burning vehicle. How she went back for someone else. She didn't run. She stayed." He took a shaky step forward. "And now you're firing her, because of her face?" No one laughed this time. Tanya rose slowly to her feet, towel still dangling from one hand, the other wiping a streak of water, or maybe something else, from her cheek. She looked at Elijah, and for the first time all day, her hands stopped trembling. The silence in the diner was sudden and complete, like the world had paused to hear the weight of a teenager's words. Tanya stood frozen near table 7, still holding the damp towel in her hand, eyes locked with Elijah's. For a moment, no one moved. Even the men who'd been mocking her sat stiff, their laughter curdled into confusion. Elijah's hands shook as he reached into his wallet. From the worn leather fold, he pulled out a small, faded photograph. He took 2 steps closer, holding it out so the room could see. "This is my dad," he said, voice steadier now. "Captain Marcus Hayes, 10th Mountain Division." He turned the photo toward Tanya. She recognized it instantly. Her and Marcus, both younger, faces dusty and sunburned under the harsh light of an Iraqi desert. Her arm was slung around his shoulder, his smile crooked from the concussion he hadn't yet admitted to. In the background, their unit's medical tent sagged slightly from the wind, and despite everything, they were both smiling. Elijah's voice carried through the diner, no longer shaking. "My dad told me what happened. Their convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. One of the Humvees exploded. He was trapped inside. Everyone else had scattered, but not her. Tanya pulled him out while bullets were flying. His leg was shattered. She patched him up right there, then carried him across open ground, under fire, back to the med tent. A gasp broke from somewhere in the room. Still, Elijah continued. And she didn't stop there. She went back. Ran back into the fire to pull out another soldier. She could have died. Everyone thought she did. But she came home. He looked around now, meeting the eyes of every person in the room. And now she's being laughed at. Treated like garbage. Fired. Because of what she looks like. The room held its breath. From the far corner booth, an elderly man rose slowly. His back was stiff, his gait measured by time and memory. He wore a faded army jacket, the patch on the sleeve nearly threadbare. He stepped forward until he stood beside Elijah, then turned toward Tanya. With a deliberate motion, he raised his hand to his brow and offered a formal salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gravel and steel, "I failed you today. But I won't fail again." Tanya's lips parted slightly, her throat tight. The towel dropped from her fingers and landed on the floor with a soft thud. One by one, others stood. A woman near the door with tears in her eyes. A man who had laughed just minutes earlier but now looked down, ashamed. A waitress, Cassie, stepping out from behind the counter with hands clasped to her chest. The diner, once filled with noise and judgment, became a place of reverent silence, then quiet movement. Chairs scraped gently as people rose, not in protest, not in pity, but in respect. Not for a waitress. Not for a veteran. But for a woman who had bled for a country that now, at last, remembered how to say thank you. Tanya looked from face to face, the weight of years pressing on her chest. And then she met Elijah's eyes again, full of courage, full of truth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself breathe. 1 week later, the sign above Maple House Diner changed. The old hand-painted lettering that had chipped and faded with time was replaced with bold new words in deep navy blue: "Veterans served here. With honor." It was a quiet statement but a powerful one, visible to anyone who passed by on Main Street, etched into the very heart of a town that had once looked the other way. Inside, Tanya's absence was felt even before the door opened. The booth by the window where she used to refill coffee, the sound of her steady footsteps crossing the tile floor, those things lingered in memory. Grace, the owner, who had once seen Tanya as a liability, now found herself pausing in the mornings, staring at the new sign as if trying to reconcile it with her own regret. It was Grace who made the call. The day after the incident, she reached out to a local artist, a quiet man named Daniel who worked above the florist shop and rarely took commissions. "I want to honor her," she said, voice gruff, hands trembling slightly. "But I need someone who can see past scars." Daniel nodded without hesitation. The portrait took 5 days. When Tanya returned to pick up her last paycheck, more out of courtesy than expectation, Grace surprised her. She brought out the framed canvas from the back room and placed it gently on the counter. Tanya stared at it in silence. It was her, captured in incredible detail, standing tall in her Maple House uniform, apron tied neatly, name tag visible beneath a tiny American flag pin. Behind her, the background blended softly into a flowing U.S. flag, not loud or dramatic, but solemn, proud. The brushstrokes around her face were tender, deliberate, framing the scars not as flaws but as part of her strength. Above her shoulder, etched in careful script, were the words, "Not all wounds bleed. Some shine." For a long moment, Tanya couldn't speak. Grace cleared her throat. "I didn't ask. I should have. I never thought about who you really were. I only saw what I didn't understand." Her voice cracked. "This town was wrong. I was wrong." Tanya blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. That same afternoon, she received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs in Denver. Word had spread, through Elijah's family, through veterans in nearby counties, even on local news. Someone at the VA had seen the footage Elijah's mother had recorded on her phone, the boy's testimony going viral for a brief, blinding moment. "We could use someone like you," the woman on the line had said. "Someone who understands what it means to come home changed." They offered Tanya a full-time position as a communications representative for returning veterans, helping others navigate the very systems that had once ignored her. Tanya accepted. Not for recognition. Not even for redemption. But because for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged somewhere beyond survival. Maple House Diner kept her picture on the wall near the register. Customers now stopped to look at it, not out of discomfort, but out of reverence. The photo, the painting, and the new sign above the door became a kind of pilgrimage for some. A reminder that courage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it simply shows up, scarred, silent, and stronger than most will ever understand. 6 months later, the auditorium at Pine Ridge High School was packed. Rows of students in formal dress shirts and school blazers filled the seats, the American flag hanging heavy behind the stage as brass instruments from the school band played a slow, respectful tune. It was Veterans Day, and this year, the school had chosen a guest speaker who, until recently, might have passed through town unnoticed. Tanya Brooks stood just behind the curtain, smoothing her blazer with steady hands. She hadn't worn her uniform in years, but today, she didn't need it. Her scars remained, unhidden. She no longer tried to conceal them with makeup or dim lighting. They were part of her story now, not a secret to be buried, but a legacy to be carried. As she stepped onto the stage, polite applause greeted her, along with a few curious glances from students who hadn't yet made the connection. The principal gave a brief introduction, then nodded toward the podium. But before Tanya could speak, Elijah Hayes rose from the front row. Dressed in a crisp button-up shirt and tie, he walked confidently to the microphone, his posture straight, his tone clear and strong, so much like his father's it sent a ripple through Tanya's chest. "I'd like to say something before Ms. Brooks begins," he said, "because you need to know who she is before you hear her speak." The room hushed. Every eye turned toward him. "Heroes don't always return home in one piece," Elijah said, pausing. "But sometimes, their courage is more whole than we'll ever understand." He turned toward Tanya now, nodding once, then stepped back. Tanya stood silent for a moment, her hand brushing gently along her cheek. Her fingers touched the raised tissue that had once made her avoid every mirror she passed. But now, the gesture wasn't one of shame. It was something else, recognition, even pride. "These aren't wounds," she began softly, her voice carrying to the back of the auditorium without effort. "They're witness. That I was there. That I helped. That when someone needed me, I didn't run." She paused. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. "I used to think these scars made me less. That they turned people away. And for a while, they did. But I've learned that courage doesn't always get applause. Sometimes it just waits for someone to see it." She looked toward Elijah, who held her gaze with quiet strength. "If you remember anything from today," she continued, "remember this: we don't get to choose the battles we face. But we do get to choose who we become because of them. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stand up, when no one else will." She stepped back from the podium. And for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then from somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone stood. Then another. And another. Applause rose slowly, then swelled, filling the auditorium with sound. Not of pity, not of sorrow, but of respect. Tears glistened in the eyes of teachers, parents, students. Tanya didn't flinch. She stood tall, her scars catching the soft glow of stage lights like medals unpinned. That day, the students of Pine Ridge didn't just meet a veteran. They met a woman who carried her past not as a burden, but as proof that even the deepest wounds could leave behind something unbreakable. Maybe you'll forget her apron. Maybe you'll forget her scars. But don't forget the teenager who stood up. or the silence that followed when truth was finally spoken. If you believe courage deserves a second glance, like, share, and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD. Because justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes, it wears scars.